The father paid for his sick daughter's treatment for years, until one day, suspecting something, he installed a recorder at home. When he listened to the record, he discovered that the truth was much worse than his darkest suspicions. The small and modest kitchen was illuminated only by the yellowish light from the lamp hanging over the worn wooden table. Richard, a 48-year-old man with dark hair already sprinkled with grey strands, was bent over a pile of coins and crumpled bills that he had carefully poured onto the surface. His calloused hands, marked by heavy work, trembled slightly as he separated each penny, his sunburned skin betraying the long hours under intense heat. The deep lines around his brown eyes revealed not only age, but the constant weight of worry he carried on his shoulders. 23, 24, 25, he muttered to himself, trying to make the numbers match the needed amount. Please, let it be enough this time for Emily's medicine. The sound of high heels on the ceramic floor broke the silence of early morning, announcing Patricia's arrival down the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen already fully dressed, with her blonde hair perfectly aligned and an impeccable white blouse that contrasted with the simple environment of the house. Her 42 years were well maintained, with an appearance suggesting someone who dedicated considerable time and resources to her own image. Her angular face and cold blue eyes quickly examined the table where Richard was counting money, and without any word of thanks, she extended her hand with calculated naturalness. "I need to leave early today. Let me take care of Emily's medications," she said, taking the bills without waiting for a response. "You don't need to worry about these complicated hospital matters." Richard raised his tired eyes to his wife, feeling a tightness in his chest, seeing how she handled the money that had cost him sleepless nights and double shifts at work. The difference between them seemed more evident each day. While he withered under the weight of responsibilities, she maintained an impeccable appearance and increasingly distant behavior. "Patricia, wait a minute," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite growing irritation. "These medicines are costing more and more. Last month they were 200, now they're already over 300. This big difference doesn't make sense." He clenched his fists on the table, observing how she avoided his direct gaze. "Maybe it's time for me to personally talk with Dr. Catherine. Perhaps she can suggest some cheaper alternative, or even a government program." Patricia's face immediately hardened, and she crossed her arms in a defensive posture that Richard had learned to recognize over their years of marriage. It was the same expression she used whenever she felt confronted about her decisions. "Richard, you don't understand anything about medicine," she said, with a cutting tone that echoed through the silent kitchen. "These medications are imported. They're expensive indeed. Dr. Catherine already explained that Emily's treatment is complex and that we can't economize on our daughter's health." She adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder, clearly impatient to leave. "If you really want to help, keep working hard as you've been doing, and let me take care of the medical part, which is a woman's thing anyway." The comment hit Richard like a punch to the stomach, but he swallowed his wounded pride and tried one last approach. The image of his pale and fragile daughter in bed was stronger than any personal discomfort. "It's not about not trusting you, Patricia. It's that I want to participate more in our girl's life," he said, rising from the chair and walking toward her. "It's been more than 6 months since I went to an appointment with you. I work so much that sometimes I feel like I don't know my own daughter anymore." His words came out laden with genuine sadness that made Patricia hesitate for a moment. "I just want to understand how I can better help as a father." Patricia sighed dramatically and looked at the gold watch on her wrist, a piece that Richard didn't remember seeing before. "Richard, you already work too much. You're always doing overtime. You come home exhausted, barely have time to rest," she said, slightly softening her tone of voice. "Leave this to me. I know how to talk to the doctors. I know how to ask the right questions. You worry about bringing income home, and I'll worry about our daughter's treatment." She approached and briefly touched his face with her cold hand, a gesture that was once affectionate in the past, but now seemed mechanical. "Besides, Emily gets very tired after appointments. It's better that she comes straight home to rest." Richard felt the bitter taste of frustration in his mouth, but he knew that arguing with Patricia when she was in a hurry was a lost battle. He had learned that his wife had a special ability to turn any questioning into a discussion about how he didn't value her efforts. "All right, Patricia, But promise you'll ask Dr. Catherine about cheaper alternatives, he said, resigned. And if Emily gets worse, call me immediately at work. No matter what I'm doing, I'll drop everything and come home. The concern in his voice was palpable, as was the unconditional love he felt for his daughter. She is the most important thing in my life. Alone in the kitchen after Patricia left, Richard remained motionless for a few minutes, processing the conversation and trying to identify what bothered him so much about his wife's words. There was something in the way she talked about Emily's treatment, an excessive ease, as if she already had all the answers memorized. He put away the few coins that were left on the table, shaking his head to try to push away the negative thoughts. Maybe I'm being paranoid after all, he thought, rubbing his face with his rough hands. Work and fatigue must be making me imagine things where they don't exist. The silence of the house weighed on his shoulders as he slowly climbed the stairs toward his daughter's room. Each step seemed to echo louder in the quietness of the early morning, and Richard found himself thinking about how his life had changed drastically since Emily had fallen ill. Before, the house was full of laughter and animated conversations during breakfast, with the girl telling about the dreams she had or making plans for the weekend. How things have changed so much in such a short time, he muttered to himself, stopping in front of the slightly open bedroom door. My girl used to be so full of life and joy. The door creaked softly when he pushed it, revealing the small and cozy room that he had decorated with such care when Emily was just a baby. The light pink walls still displayed the colorful drawings she had made herself a few years ago, when she still had energy for artistic activities. The twin bed occupied the center of the room, and on it was Emily, his 14-year-old daughter, who seemed half her age due to the extreme paleness and fragility that the illness had imposed on her young body. The dark brown hair, which was once voluminous and shiny, was now straight and lifeless, spread over the white pillow. "Hi, my princess," Richard said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling today?" Emily slowly turned her face toward her father, and Richard felt his heart tighten as he saw how the simple movement seemed to require considerable effort from her. The girl who used to run around the house could now barely move in bed without showing fatigue. Her lips were pale, almost the same color as her skin, and there were deep circles under eyes that should be shining with the typical vivacity of adolescence. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered in a weak voice that sounded like a distant echo of the vibrant child she had been in the past. "I'm fine, just a little tired." The automatic response sounded rehearsed, as if it was something she had learned to say. "Mom said you were counting money for my medicines again." Richard reached out and gently caressed his daughter's hair, feeling how thin and brittle it was between his fingers. It was impossible not to compare it with the silky and strong texture she had before getting sick. "Don't worry about that, my love. Daddy will always find a way to get everything you need to get better," he said, trying to inject confidence into his own voice. "The important thing is that you take all your medicines correctly and rest a lot. Soon you'll be playing in the backyard again." He forced a smile that couldn't completely hide the sadness in his eyes. "Remember how you loved to climb the mango tree? You said that from up there you could see the whole world." A flash of nostalgia passed through Emily's eyes, but was quickly replaced by a strange expression that Richard couldn't interpret. It was as if she wanted to say something important, but something prevented her from speaking. She opened her mouth slightly, as if she were going to start a sentence, then closed it again and shook her head almost imperceptibly. "I remember, Daddy," she finally said, her voice even lower. "Sometimes I dream that I'm up in the tree again." There was a deep melancholy in these words that cut Richard's heart. Will I ever be able to climb up there again? His daughter's innocent question hit him with unexpected force, and Richard had to make a conscious effort not to let the tears overflow. He leaned over and gently kissed the girl's forehead, feeling how cold her skin was despite the heated room. "Of course you will, my princess. Daddy promises that you'll go back to doing everything you enjoyed before," he said with a conviction that tried to be greater than he actually felt. "We'll beat this disease together, and when that happens, I'll build a treehouse for you." The words came out laden with hope and determination. "In the meantime, you need to be brave and keep taking your medicine, even if it tastes bad." Emily nodded slowly, but Richard noticed how she shrank slightly when he mentioned the medications. It was a subtle reaction, almost imperceptible, but he knew his daughter too well not to notice. "They really do taste awful, Daddy," she said, and for the first time in the conversation her voice seemed to have a bit more life. "Sometimes they make me feel very nauseous, and I'm afraid I'll throw up." She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether she should continue speaking. "Mom said if I complain too much about the medicine, the doctors might stop the treatment and I'll never get better." Richard felt a wave of anger directed at the situation itself and the helplessness he felt in the face of his daughter's suffering. It was unbearable to see such a young child having to deal with such heavy concepts as illness and the possibility of not recovering. "Emily, my love, you never need to be afraid to tell me how you're feeling," he said, gently holding the girl's small, cold hands. "If the medicines are making you feel sick, we can talk to Dr. Catherine to see if there's a way to reduce these side effects." He squeezed her hand softly, trying to convey reassurance through his touch. "You are the bravest person I know, and I'm very proud to be your daddy." The hours at work dragged on, with Richard constantly checking his cell phone to see if there were any messages or missed calls. He worked at a construction company, carrying heavy materials under the scorching sun, but his mind was completely focused on the daughter he had left at home. Every time the phone rang, his heart raced, fearing it might be bad news about Emily's condition. "Richard, are you okay?" asked Raymond, his supervisor, during the lunch break. "You seem more worried than usual today." Richard took a sip of the lukewarm water from his thermos and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his already soaked shirt. "It's Emily, Raymond. She woke up today looking even more fragile than yesterday," he said, looking at the horizon as if he could see through walls all the way to his daughter's room. "Sometimes I wonder if the medications are actually working. She's been on this treatment for so long and I don't see any improvement." He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders. Worse yet, the medicines are getting more and more expensive. Raymond, a 50-year-old man who had gone through his own family difficulties, placed a sympathetic hand on his friend's shoulder. "Look, Richard, I know it's not easy, but you're doing everything you can for your little girl," he said sincerely. "Maybe it's time to get a second medical opinion. Sometimes doctors get used to one type of treatment and can't see other alternatives." He waited for Richard to process the suggestion before continuing. "My sister-in-law went through something similar with her son until she found another professional who completely changed the approach." When he finally arrived home late in the afternoon, Richard found the house in complete silence. Patricia had not yet returned from the appointment, which was strange considering they normally returned in the middle of the afternoon. He quietly climbed the stairs and found Emily lying in the same position he had left her in the morning. "Emily," he called softly, pushing the door open slowly. "How was your day, my princess?" The girl opened her eyes slowly as if she were fighting against a deep fatigue that went beyond the normal need for sleep. When she focused her gaze on her father, Richard noticed there was something different in her expression, a kind of resigned sadness that immediately worried him. "Hi, Daddy," she said in a voice even weaker than in the morning. "You came home early today." She tried to sit up in bed, but the movement seemed to require a disproportionate effort. "Mom hasn't come back from the appointment yet." Richard approached the bed and placed his hand on his daughter's forehead, checking if she had a fever. Her skin was cold and damp, which was concerning. "Did you eat lunch today?" he asked, already knowing what the answer would be from the girl's general condition. "Are you feeling sick again?" He sat on the edge of the bed and took Emily's small hand, noticing how it was even colder than in the morning. "Maybe we should call Dr. Catherine and ask if it's normal for you to be feeling worse after taking the medications." Emily hesitated for a long moment, and Richard could see she was fighting some kind of internal battle. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked several times, trying to hold them back. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" she finally said, in a voice so low he had to lean in to hear properly. "Do you promise you won't be angry with me?" The question came loaded with anxiety that made Richard's heart race. "And do you promise you won't tell Mom I asked?" Richard felt a chill in his stomach, hearing his daughter's request. It was the first time she had asked to hide something from her mother, and it deeply concerned him. "Emily, you can ask me anything, and I'll never be angry with you for asking questions," he said, trying to convey reassurance despite his own anxiety. "But tell me what's worrying you." Dad is here to help you with anything." The tears Emily had tried to hold back finally began to roll down her pale face, and she turned slightly in bed to face her father. "Dad, is it possible for someone to pretend they're sick for a long time?" she asked, and the words tumbled out as if she was afraid of losing her courage. "Like, could someone take medicine that makes them sick on purpose?" The question was asked with an innocence that brutally contrasted with the gravity of what she was suggesting. "Because sometimes I wonder if—" "Forget it, Dad. I think these are just silly thoughts." Richard felt as if the world had stopped spinning around him. His daughter's words echoed in his mind like an alarm bell he couldn't ignore. Emily's innocent question had touched exactly on the point that had been bothering him for weeks. "Emily, those aren't silly thoughts," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions. "Why are you thinking about this? Did something happen that made you think someone might be faking an illness?" He held both of the girl's hands, looking directly into her eyes. "If you know something important, you need to tell me, even if it's difficult." Before Emily could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by Patricia's familiar footsteps climbing the stairs. The girl immediately shrank into the bed and quickly wiped the tears from her face as if she had been caught doing something wrong. "Dad, please don't tell her anything," she urgently whispered. "Promise you won't tell." The urgency in her voice was alarming. "She's coming up now. Pretend we were talking about normal things." Patricia appeared in the doorway with a smile that Richard thought was too forced to be genuine. She was carrying a pharmacy bag and seemed slightly out of breath, as if she had hurried up the stairs. "Hello, dear, you're home early today," she said, quickly kissing Richard's cheek without really looking at him. "Doctor." Catherine said that Emily might be going through a slightly more difficult phase of the treatment, but that this is completely normal. The words flowed too smoothly, as if she had rehearsed them on the way. She changed the medication a bit. "Now you'll take these blue pills along with the others." Richard observed the scene with new attention, noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way Patricia avoided looking directly at him when talking about the appointment, how she seemed to have all the answers ready, how Emily shrank whenever her mother approached. "Patricia, did you ask Dr. Catherine about getting a second opinion?" he asked, deciding to test his suspicions. "And about cheaper alternatives for the medications?" Patricia's face hardened almost imperceptibly, but Richard managed to catch the change in expression. "Richard, Doctor, Catherine is a very competent professional. She said that seeking other opinions at this time could interfere with the treatment," she replied, nervously handling the medicine bottles. "Besides, Emily is already used to her, and changing doctors now could be traumatic." She opened one of the bottles and poured 2 blue pills into the palm of her hand. "These are the new ones. The doctor said they might cause a bit more nausea at first." Richard observed how Emily looked at the pills with an expression that could only be described as fear. It was the same expression she had when she was little and needed to get a shot, but multiplied by 10. "Are these pills different from the others?" he asked, trying to grab one of the bottles to examine. "What's the name of the active ingredient?" He tried to read the label, but noticed it was partially peeled off, making it impossible to identify the medication. "Can you show me the prescription the doctor gave you?" Patricia abruptly closed the bottle and put it in the bag, away from Richard's reach. "Honey, you don't need to worry about these technical details. I've already researched everything and talked extensively with Dr. Catherine," she said, in a tone that made it clear she considered the matter closed. "The important thing is that Emily takes the medications at the right time." She turned to her daughter and held out the blue pills. "Come on, my love. Take them now so you don't forget." At that moment, Richard had the clear sensation that he was witnessing something very wrong. Emily's reluctance, Patricia's rush, the impossibility of verifying the medications, everything seemed to fit into a disturbing pattern. "Emily, wait a moment," he said impulsively, placing his hand over his daughter's. "How about we wait until after dinner? Maybe it's better to take them on a full stomach." The suggestion seemed logical, but he could see how visibly irritated Patricia became. Or better yet, how about if I call Dr. Catherine personally? The night passed slowly, with Richard pretending to sleep while his mind was buzzing with suspicions he could no longer ignore. At 2 in the morning, He woke up to a noise coming from Emily's room. He got up silently and walked down the hallway to his daughter's partially open door. Through the gap, he could see Patricia leaning over the bed, whispering something in Emily's ear, who was quietly crying. "You need to understand that this is for our own good," he heard fragments of the conversation. "If Daddy finds out..." Richard moved closer to the door, trying to hear better, but a step creaked under his feet. Patricia quickly moved away from the bed and left the room, passing him in the hallway with a forced smile. "She was having a nightmare," she said casually. "I just put her back to sleep." But Richard had seen the tears on Emily's face and the expression of fear in her eyes. At that moment, all the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in his mind, forming a terrifying image that he didn't want to accept. Something is very wrong here, he thought, feeling a chill down his spine. Very, very wrong. Dawn still weighed heavily on the city when Richard made the hardest decision in years. He would miss work for the first time since he had started at the construction company. His hands trembled as he typed the message to Raymond, inventing an excuse about urgent family problems that needed his immediate attention. The image of Emily silently crying the night before, and especially the words Patricia had whispered in her daughter's room, hammered in his mind like an alarm he couldn't turn off. He observed his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, noticing the deep dark circles and the stubble that betrayed a sleepless night. "Today I'm going to find out what's really happening with my daughter," he muttered to himself, adjusting the dress shirt he had specially set aside for the occasion. "I can no longer pretend I'm not seeing the strange signs that appear every day." Richard went downstairs silently, avoiding the steps that creaked so as not to wake anyone before time. In the kitchen, he prepared a strong coffee and stood watching through the window, the sunrise painting the sky in orange hues, a beauty that contrasted dramatically with the anguish he felt in his chest. Patricia had mentioned the night before that the appointment with Dr. Catherine would be at 9 in the morning, which meant they would leave the house around 8:30. He sipped the bitter coffee, mentally rehearsing the questions he would ask the doctor about Emily's treatment, about the expensive medications, and about the lack of visible improvements after months of intensive treatment. "I'm going to ask everything I need to know, and this time nobody will stop me from understanding what's happening," he thought, feeling a determination he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm her father. I have every right to be present." At 8 o'clock sharp, Richard heard movements upstairs indicating that Patricia and Emily were preparing to leave. He discreetly went upstairs and observed through the bedroom door crack as Patricia helped her daughter get dressed, noticing how her gestures seemed rushed and how Emily moved with even more difficulty than the day before. The girl was visibly paler, and when Patricia helped her put on her shoes, Richard could see how Emily's hands trembled slightly. "Emily, remember what we talked about last night," he heard Patricia say in a low but firm voice. "It's important that you behave properly during the appointment and don't ask unnecessary questions to the doctor." The tone wasn't affectionate, as it should be between mother and daughter before an important medical appointment. "Let me do all the talking that needs to be done, okay?" Emily merely nodded, but Richard noticed how intimidated she seemed by her own mother, a dynamic he had never noticed so clearly before. When the two went downstairs and headed for the door, Richard waited a few minutes before leaving the house, took his old car and followed in the direction of the clinic where the appointment was supposedly to take place. During the journey, his mind was buzzing with different scenarios. Perhaps he was exaggerating his suspicions. Perhaps Patricia was really doing what was best for her daughter. Perhaps his paranoia was the result of stress and excessive worry. But deep in his heart, an insistent voice whispered that something was fundamentally wrong with the whole situation. "If everything is normal, I'll apologize to Patricia and admit I was being unfair," he reflected, parking the car in front of the building where Dr. Catherine's office was located. "But if my suspicions are right..." The clinic occupied the second floor of a modest commercial building, with a clean but unpretentious facade that inspired confidence. Richard climbed the stairs with his heart beating rapidly, rehearsing the words he would use to explain to the receptionist why he had arrived unannounced at his daughter's appointment. The corridor was silent, with only the muffled sound of conversations coming from the closed offices, and the characteristic smell of hospital disinfectant hung in the air. When he pushed open the glass door with Dr. Catherine's name engraved in golden letters, Richard was greeted by a middle-aged woman sitting behind a desk, organizing patient files. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" she asked with a professional smile, looking at an open agenda in front of her. "I don't see any available slots for this morning." Richard approached the desk, taking from his pocket a piece of paper where he had written Emily's full name. "Actually, my daughter Emily should have an appointment scheduled for 9 o'clock this morning with Dr. Catherine," he explained, trying to keep his voice calm despite his growing anxiety. "I'm her father, and since I've never been able to attend any appointments because of work, I decided to take the day off to participate this time." He carefully observed the receptionist's face as she flipped through the pages of the agenda, looking for Emily's name among the day's appointments. "My wife Patricia always brings her alone, but I thought it was important to be present at least once." The words came out naturally, but Richard felt his stomach contracting while he waited for the answer. "They must be here already. They arrived a few minutes before me." The receptionist frowned and went back to examine the agenda more carefully, running her finger along the handwritten lines and even checking the notes in the margins of the pages. "Sir, I'm sorry, but there is no appointment scheduled for today in Emily's name," she said, raising her eyes with a confused expression. "In fact, checking here in the records of the last few months, I don't see any recent scheduling for this patient." She opened a drawer and took out a folder with alphabetically organized files, again looking for the girl's name. "Can I see Dr. Catherine's card that your wife has? Sometimes there is confusion with other professionals who work in the same building." The woman's tone was gentle, but there was growing concern in her voice. "Perhaps your wife got confused with the address or with the doctor's name." The world seemed to spin around Richard as he processed that devastating information. His legs weakened and he had to lean on the desk to keep his balance, feeling as if he had received a punch in the stomach that had taken all the air from his lungs. "What do you mean there's no appointment scheduled?" "My wife clearly said the appointment would be today at 9 in the morning, he said, his voice choked with confusion and the onset of panic. "She leaves the house every week saying she's going to bring Emily for an appointment with Dr. Catherine." He ran his hand through his hair, trying to organize the thoughts that were piling up in his mind. "They left home less than an hour ago specifically to come here." The words came out jumbled, as if he were trying to convince himself that there was some mistake. Where could they be then? The receptionist stood up from her chair and walked over to Richard, clearly concerned about the desperate state of the man in front of her. "Sir, are you okay? Would you like me to call someone?" she asked, gently placing a hand on his arm to offer support. "Perhaps your wife changed doctors and forgot to tell you, or maybe she got confused about the appointment day." Her suggestions were well-intentioned, but Richard knew that none of them explained the real situation. "I can call other clinics in the area to see if there's an appointment scheduled for your daughter." The woman's kindness contrasted drastically with the whirlwind of dark suspicions that was beginning to form in Richard's mind. Sometimes patients get confused between different offices. Richard shook his head and staggered toward the door, mumbling confused thanks to the receptionist who continued offering help. On the building stairs, he stopped and sat on one of the steps, putting his head in his hands while trying to process that shocking revelation. Patricia had lied about the appointment, had lied about taking Emily to the doctor, had lied about everything related to their daughter's treatment. If they're not here, where the hell are they? He thought, feeling a toxic mixture of anger and terror taking over his chest. And if there are no real appointments, what is Patricia doing with Emily during all these outings? The questions multiplied in his mind like a hydra, each possible answer being worse than the previous one. My God, what horrible situation have I put my daughter in by blindly trusting Patricia? The journey back home passed like a blur, with Richard driving on autopilot, while his mind worked feverishly to try to understand the extent of the lies he had discovered. He parked the car a block away from his own house, not wanting Patricia to know that he had skipped work to investigate the supposed medical appointment. He walked slowly through the neighborhood streets, trying to buy time to think of a strategy for how to approach his wife about the lies without causing an argument that could harm Emily even more. The morning sun was strong, but Richard felt an internal coldness that no external temperature could warm. "I need to stay calm and be smart," he said to himself, stopping in front of the house and observing the closed windows. "If I arrive agitated and accuse Patricia directly, She might invent more lies or even do something worse to Emily. When Richard opened the house door, he was greeted by the sound of the television in the living room, where he found a scene that disturbed him even more. Patricia and Emily were sitting on the sofa watching a morning show, completely relaxed, as if it were a normal day of rest. Patricia was well-dressed and wearing makeup, but didn't appear to have left the house, and Emily was in her pajamas, lying with her head on her mother's lap in a position that suggested she had spent the entire morning there. The normality of that domestic scene contrasted brutally with the elaborate lie that Patricia had constructed about the medical appointment. "Richard, what are you doing home?" exclaimed Patricia, quickly rising from the sofa with a poorly disguised expression of surprise. "I thought you had gone to work as usual." Her voice had a high pitch that Richard recognized as a sign of nervousness. Did something happen at work? Richard slowly approached the sofa, carefully observing the two most important people in his life and trying to decipher the truth behind that facade of normality. Emily raised her eyes to him with an expression that mixed surprise and something that could be relief, as if his unexpected presence was an answer to a silent prayer. "Patricia, I need to ask you a very important question," he said, sitting in the armchair across from the sofa and crossing his arms. "Where were you this morning? You had said that the appointment with Dr. Catherine would be at 9 o'clock. He kept his tone calm, but his eyes were fixed on his wife's face, looking for any sign of lying or discomfort. "How was the appointment? What did the doctor say about Emily's condition?" The questions were asked slowly, giving Patricia time to process each one. "And why did you return so early if these appointments usually take the entire morning?" Patricia blinked several times rapidly, a nervous tic that Richard had learned to recognize over the years of marriage, and her right hand began to play with a gold ring she wore on her index finger. "Richard, what a strange question." "The appointment was normal, like always," she said, trying to maintain a natural smile on her face. "Dr. Catherine examined Emily, adjusted some medications, and said she's responding well to the treatment, despite the difficulties." She sat down again beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. "We came back early because Emily was feeling nauseous after the new medications, so the doctor released her to rest at home." The explanation flowed too smoothly, as if it had been prepared in advance. "Why all these questions? You've never been so interested in the details of the appointments before." Richard leaned forward in the armchair, maintaining direct eye contact with Patricia, while carefully formulating his next question with calculated care. "Patricia, this is very strange because I stopped by Dr. Catherine's clinic a little while ago, wanting to participate in the consultation as a surprise," he said, observing how her face instantly paled. "The receptionist informed me that there was no appointment scheduled for today, and that actually there are no records of Emily's consultations in the past few months." He paused, letting the gravity of that information weigh in the air between them. "She also said she didn't know any patient named Emily among the cases followed by Dr. Catherine." Richard's voice remained calm, but there was a growing firmness in his tone. "So I'm going to ask you again, where were you two this morning?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the television that continued cheerfully broadcasting its morning program, indifferent to the family drama unfolding in the living room. Emily looked alternately at her father and mother with wide eyes, clearly sensing that something very serious was happening, but not fully understanding the nature of the conflict. Patricia opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable. "Richard, there must have been some mistake at the clinic," she finally said, but her voice was visibly trembling. "Maybe the receptionist is new and doesn't know all the patients, or maybe she looked in the wrong place." Her hands began to shake slightly, and she hid them in the folds of her skirt. "You know how disorganized these receptionists can be sometimes." Richard rose from the armchair and began to walk around the room, trying to control the anger growing inside him like a storm about to explode. "Patricia, stop lying to me," he said, stopping in front of the window and turning to face her directly. The receptionist checked all the records, including the old files, and found no reference to Emily as Dr. Catherine's patient. He crossed his arms over his chest, assuming a more authoritative posture that he rarely used in family discussions. "She was very kind, and even offered to call other clinics in the area to check if there was any confusion about addresses. His voice was getting louder, and he had to make a conscious effort not to shout in front of his daughter. "So I'm going to ask for the last time, and I want the truth. Where the hell have you been going when you leave the house saying you're going to the doctor?" Tears began to well up in Patricia's eyes, and she covered her face with her hands in a dramatically desperate gesture that Richard had seen many times over the years of marriage. "Richard, I can't believe you're accusing me of lying about our own daughter's health," she said, her voice choked with tears. "After everything I've sacrificed for this family, after all the nights I've stayed awake caring for Emily when she had a fever, after all my effort to find the best possible treatment for her." She got up from the sofa and walked toward Richard, extending her arms in a theatrical plea. "How can you distrust me like this? How can you question the love I feel for our daughter?" Tears streamed down her face, but there was something calculated in her performance that made Richard feel even more suspicious. "I am a dedicated mother, Richard. Everything I do is for Emily's good." Richard observed that display of emotion with a new detachment, as if he were seeing Patricia for the first time and recognizing patterns of behavior that he had ignored for years. "Patricia, your tears aren't going to make me forget the fact that you lied about taking our daughter to the doctor," he said, keeping his voice firm despite the pain he felt in his chest. "If you're really concerned about Emily's welfare, then explain to me where you've been going during all these months when you leave the house supposedly for medical appointments." He moved closer to her, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "And explain to me why the medications you bring home cost a fortune if there's no doctor officially prescribing them." The question hung in the air like an accusation that could no longer be ignored. "What are you doing with the money I give for our daughter's treatment?" Emily, who had remained silent throughout that tense discussion, finally spoke up with a weak but clear voice that cut through Patricia's dramatic tears. "Daddy, I wanted to tell you, but Mummy said you would be very angry with me," she said, trying to sit more upright on the sofa despite her evident weakness. "We don't go to a real doctor. Mommy takes me to a park far from here, and we sit on a bench until it's time to go home." Her words fell like bombs in the silent room, and Patricia turned to her with an expression of pure panic. "Mommy said it was our secret, and if I told you, you would stop loving us and leave home forever." The innocence in Emily's voice contrasted brutally with the gravity of her revelations. "But I don't like lying to Daddy." The daughter's confession hit Richard like lightning, confirming his worst suspicions and revealing an even deeper betrayal than he had imagined. Patricia quickly approached Emily, trying to silence her with desperate gestures, but Richard positioned himself between them, protecting the girl from any possible retaliation. "Emily, my princess, you did the right thing telling Daddy the truth," he said, kneeling beside the sofa and taking the small, cold hands of his daughter. "You never need to be afraid to tell me anything, and I will never stop loving you no matter what happens." He looked into the girl's eyes, conveying all the security and protection he could muster. "Daddy is here to protect you always." Then he turned to Patricia with a contained fury that made his eyes dangerously shine. "And you, Patricia, are going to explain to me exactly what is happening here, or I'll call the police right now." The rest of the day passed in a suffocating tension, with Patricia alternating between tears of self-pity and desperate attempts to justify her lies with explanations that made no sense at all. Richard remained vigilant at Emily's side, observing every movement of his wife and beginning to mentally question all aspects of his daughter's supposed medical treatment. At night, when it was time for Emily to take her daily medications, Richard decided to observe the ritual with new and disturbing attention. Patricia brought the usual bottles from the kitchen, poured the colorful pills into the palm of her hand, and offered them to her daughter with the same forced smile as always. "Come on, dear, time for medicine," she said. But Richard noticed how her voice sounded nervous. "Take everything properly to get better soon." Richard positioned himself strategically on the opposite side of the bed, directly observing Emily's face as she received the medications. What he saw deeply disturbed him. The girl was not just showing disgust for the bitter taste of the pills, but genuine fear, as if she were being forced to ingest something she knew was harmful to her health. Her eyes filled with tears as she put the pills in her mouth, and her hands visibly trembled when she took the glass of water. "Emily, is everything okay, my love?" Richard asked softly, noticing how she quickly looked at Patricia before answering. "If you're feeling bad about any medicine, you can tell me." The girl hesitated for a long moment, clearly fighting an internal battle between fear of her mother and trust in her father. Finally, she shook her head almost imperceptibly, but her eyes remained fixed on Patricia, in an expression that Richard interpreted as pure terror. "Everything's fine, Daddy," she said in a weak voice, but Richard realized she was lying to protect herself from some consequence she feared. "I'm just a little tired." Patricia smiled, satisfied with her daughter's response, but Richard caught an exchange of glances between them that made him feel a chill down his spine. The medicines sometimes make her a bit drowsy. The next morning, Richard woke up determined to discover more clues about what was really happening in his home. While Patricia was showering and Emily was still sleeping, he went down to the kitchen and began to discreetly search through the corners where she usually kept the medical supplies. In the cabinet under the sink, he found a plastic bag full of empty medication boxes that had been placed with the trash to be taken out. His hands trembled as he examined the packages, looking for medicine names or information that could clarify what Emily was really taking. "I'm going to take these boxes to a pharmacy and ask what these medications are for," he thought, putting the packages in a separate bag. "I need to understand what Patricia is giving to our daughter." Richard waited until lunchtime, when Patricia was busy preparing food in the kitchen, to discreetly leave the house carrying the bag with the empty medication boxes. He walked to the nearest pharmacy, located a few blocks away in the neighborhood shopping center, mentally rehearsing how he would explain his situation to the pharmacist without revealing the dark suspicions that tormented him. The establishment was small but well organized, with shelves full of medications and hygiene products, and a counter where a middle-aged man in a white coat attended to customers. "Good morning. How can I help you?" asked the pharmacist with a professional smile when Richard approached the counter. "Do you need any medication or do you have questions about treatments?" Richard placed the bag on the counter and removed one of the empty boxes, trying to keep his hands steady despite the nervousness he felt. "Look, I wanted to ask about this medication here," he said, showing the package to the pharmacist. "My daughter has been taking this medicine for several months as part of a treatment, but I'd like to better understand what exactly it's for." He carefully observed the man's face as he examined the empty box, looking for any sign of recognition or concern. "She's been showing some strange side effects, and I want to make sure the medication is being used correctly." The lie came naturally, but Richard felt his stomach contracting with anxiety. "Could you explain what the main function of this medicine is?" The pharmacist adjusted his glasses and carefully examined the label on the package, frowning as he read the technical information printed in small letters. "Sir, this medication here is very specific," he said, raising his eyes with a worried expression. "It's mainly used to induce nausea and weakness in patients who are going to undergo certain types of surgery, to prepare the body for complex medical procedures." He turned the box, showing the technical information to Richard. "It's not a medication used in prolonged treatments. It's usually administered only for a few days before an operation." The pharmacist's tone was becoming more serious. "May I ask what kind of surgery your daughter is having? Because if she's been taking this for months, there might be a problem with the prescription." Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet as he processed that devastating information. His legs went weak and he had to lean on the counter to avoid collapsing right there, feeling as if he had received a punch to the stomach that had taken all the air from his lungs. "What do you mean, induce nausea and weakness?" he asked with a choked voice, barely able to form the words. "Are you saying this medicine doesn't cure any disease, but instead might be being used incorrectly and harmfully?" The implications of that revelation exploded in his mind like fireworks, each one more terrifying than the last. "My God, what is Patricia doing to our daughter?" The whisper came out involuntarily, and the pharmacist leaned over the counter with growing concern. "Can this medicine cause permanent damage if used incorrectly?" The night passed like an endless nightmare for Richard, who remained lying in bed with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to find a single moment of peace or rest. The pharmacist's words echoed in his mind like a relentless hammer. Medication to induce nausea and weakness, used only before surgeries, never in prolonged treatments. Every time he tried to close his eyes, the image of Emily swallowing the blue pills with terror in her eyes came back to haunt him, mixed with the tears she silently shed whenever Patricia approached with the medication bottles. Beside him, Patricia slept deeply, with a serene expression that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate for someone who was poisoning her own daughter. "How could I have been so blind all this time?" he whispered to himself in the dark. "My poor Emily has been living a nightmare inside her own home, and I noticed nothing." When the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the bedroom curtains, Richard got up silently and went down to the kitchen, where he prepared a strong coffee while mentally organizing the next steps he should take. His hands trembled as he held the cup, not just from the fatigue of the sleepless night, but from the enormity of the decision he was about to make. He knew that confronting Patricia directly would be useless, as she had already demonstrated an impressive ability to lie and manipulate situations in her favor, creating plausible explanations and using dramatic tears to divert attention from her questionable actions. The only way to discover the complete truth about what was happening would be through concrete evidence that she couldn't deny or distort. "I need real proof of what she's doing to Emily," he thought, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup. "Without solid evidence, she'll continue lying and manipulating until she convinces me I'm imagining things." During his commute to work, Richard made a decision that made him feel as if he were betraying his own family, but which he knew was necessary to protect his daughter from a danger she couldn't fully comprehend. Instead of going directly to the construction company, he took a detour to the city center, where he found a small electronics store specializing in security equipment and recording devices. The establishment was discreet, occupying the ground floor of an old commercial building, with a modest storefront displaying cameras, recorders, and other technical equipment. When he pushed the door and heard the bell announcing his entry, Richard felt like a spy about to purchase equipment for a secret mission, a sensation that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Good morning. Can I help you with anything?" asked the salesman, a young man of approximately 25 with short hair and a store t-shirt. "Are you looking for any specific type of security equipment?" Richard approached the counter where various voice recorder models were displayed, from sophisticated devices to small, discreet ones that fit in the palm of his hand. His hands were sweating as he examined the available options, trying to choose equipment that was sensitive enough to capture conversations from a distance, but small enough to be easily hidden in his own home. "I need a voice recorder that's very discreet and has good audio quality," he said, trying to keep his voice casual despite the nervousness he felt. "It's for family matters that need to be documented." The partial lie came out with difficulty, as Richard had never been a person prone to subterfuge or deception. "It needs to have long battery life and be easy to operate, because I don't understand much about these modern technologies." He picked up one of the smaller devices and examined it in his hands. Would this one be suitable for recording conversations in a living room? The salesman nodded with professional understanding, clearly accustomed to customers who needed discretion in their purchases. "This model here is perfect for what you're looking for," he said, picking up a recorder the size of a matchbox, with a matte black finish that would make it practically invisible when hidden. It has up to 12 hours of continuous recording capacity, memory to store more than 50 hours of audio, and the microphone sensitivity allows it to capture conversations up to 5 meters away with excellent quality. He demonstrated how to turn the device on and off, showing the discrete buttons and explaining how to transfer recordings to a computer or cell phone. "It's very simple to use, sir. Just press this button to start recording and this other one to stop." Richard observed every detail of the explanation attentively, memorizing the procedures. It's the best-selling model for situations that require discrete documentation of conversations. After paying for the recorder and receiving detailed instructions about its operation, Richard put the small device in the inside pocket of his jacket and headed to work. But his mind was completely focused on the plan he was formulating to discover the truth about Emily's treatment. During the entire journey to the construction company, he mentally rehearsed the steps he would follow, He would hide the recorder in the living room, where Patricia and Emily always talked when he wasn't home, and then carefully analyze everything that was recorded. The idea of spying on his own family made him nauseous, but the memory of the tears of terror in Emily's eyes was stronger than any moral scruples he might have. If I'm wrong about my suspicions, I'll apologize to Patricia and admit I was being paranoid, he thought, parking his car at the company. But if I'm right, then my daughter needs my protection more than ever. The workday passed like mental torture for Richard, who performed his mechanical tasks of carrying materials and operating machinery while his mind was completely absorbed in the terrifying possibilities of what the recorder might reveal about the dynamics between Patricia and Emily during his absence. Each time Supervisor Raymond approached to give instructions about some task, Richard had to make an effort to concentrate on what was being said, as his thoughts were constantly turned toward home. During the lunch break, he remained sitting alone under a tree in the company yard, fiddling with the recorder in his pocket and imagining the conversations that could be taking place at that exact moment in his living room. "Raymond, do you think sometimes we can be living with someone for years without really knowing them?" he asked the supervisor when he sat down next to him to eat. "Like discovering that someone very close isn't who we thought they were?" Raymond chewed his sandwich slowly, while considering his friend's philosophically charged question, realizing there was something deeper behind that seemingly casual inquiry. "Richard, that's a heavy question for a lunch break," he said, placing his hand on his colleague's shoulder with a paternal gesture. "But I'll tell you something I've learned with age. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of surprising us, both for good and for bad." He paused to take a sip of water from his thermos, observing the worried expression on Richard's face. "If you're going through some difficult situation at home, the important thing to remember is that the truth always comes out in the end, no matter how painful it might be." Raymond had known Richard for enough years to know that he wasn't given to philosophical conversations without reason. And when the truth appears, you'll have to be prepared to make the right decisions, even if they're the most difficult ones of your life. When it finally came time to return home in the late afternoon, Richard drove through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, feeling a toxic mixture of anxiety and determination that made his heart beat rapidly inside his chest. He parked the car in the garage and remained seated for a few minutes, breathing deeply and mentally organizing his strategy to hide the recorder without raising Patricia's suspicions. The small, discreet device was stored in his pants pocket, where he could constantly feel its weight, like a physical reminder of the desperate decision he had made to protect his daughter. When he finally entered through the back door of the house, Richard was surprised by a delicious aroma coming from the kitchen and the sound of Patricia humming a cheerful melody while preparing what appeared to be a special dinner. "Hi, honey. You arrived just in time," she said, appearing at the kitchen door with a radiant smile and a floral apron tied around her waist. "I'm preparing that roast you like so much, with golden potatoes and that special sauce." Richard was immediately suspicious of that exaggerated display of affection and attention, as he knew Patricia well enough to know that she only put so much effort into cooking when she wanted something or when she was trying to compensate for some questionable behavior. During the last months of tension related to Emily's treatment, meals at home had become increasingly simple and hurried, with Patricia claiming to be too busy with her daughter's medical care to dedicate herself to elaborate cooking. "What special occasion is this, Patricia?" he asked, trying to sound casual as he walked toward the living room. "It's not anyone's birthday today that I remember." He discreetly observed the environment, identifying the perfect place to hide the recorder, behind the large sofa, where there was a small side table with a cloth that would completely cover the device. "And where is Emily? How did she spend the day?" Patricia approached him and hugged him in a way that Richard found excessively affectionate by the recent standards of their relationship, pressing her body against his and whispering in his ear with a seductive voice she hadn't used in months. "There doesn't need to be a special occasion for a wife to take good care of the husband who works so hard to support the family," she said, kissing his neck in a way that should have been affectionate, but only made Richard feel even more suspicious. "Emily is resting in her room. She had another episode of weakness this afternoon, poor thing, but she's already taken all her medications correctly as always." She moved slightly away to look into his eyes, with an expression that tried to be loving, but that Richard perceived as calculated. "I know you've been worrying a lot about her, so I decided to make this special dinner to cheer you up a bit." Patricia's overly affectionate behavior made Richard even more tense. "You deserve to be taken care of too, my love." During dinner, Richard carefully observed Patricia's every movement, noticing how she was exceptionally talkative and animated, telling funny stories about neighbors and making plans for small home renovations, as if trying to create an atmosphere of domestic normality that contrasted drastically with the tension of recent days. She served the food with exaggerated gestures of affection, cutting the meat into small pieces for him, as if he were a child, and repeatedly filling his plate even when he said he was full. "Patricia, you're very different today," he said, placing his fork on the plate and observing her directly. "Did something special happen that made you so excited?" He took a sip of water, maintaining eye contact with her. "Or are you worried about something and trying to distract me?" Patricia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly regained her composure and laughed in a way that sounded too forced to be genuine. "Richard, what a strange question. Can't a wife prepare a special dinner for her husband without having ulterior motives?" she said, getting up to fetch dessert from the kitchen. "I was just thinking that we've been going through difficult times with Emily's treatment, and that we need to come together more as a couple to face these difficulties together." When she returned with a milk pudding that she rarely bothered to make, Richard noticed that her hands were shaking slightly as she placed the bowl on the table. "Besides, Dr. Catherine said the treatment is entering a more delicate phase, so we need to stay emotionally strong." She sat down again and took his hand across the table. "I love you, Richard, and I know you love me too, despite all the pressures we're facing." After dinner, when Patricia offered to wash the dishes alone while he relaxed in the living room watching television, Richard took the perfect opportunity to hide the recorder in the location he had planned during the day. He turned the television on at a slightly higher volume than normal to mask any noise he might make, and then moved silently across the room to the side table behind the sofa. His hands were shaking as he took the small device from his pocket and carefully positioned it behind the embroidered cloth that covered the table, making sure the microphone was directed toward the area where Patricia and Emily usually sat for their daily conversations. He turned on the recorder according to the instructions he had memorized, checked that the light indicator was working, and then completely covered the device with the cloth, creating a perfect hiding place that would be impossible to detect casually. "Please let me be wrong about my suspicions," he murmured quietly, feeling like a traitor to his own family. "But if I'm right, at least I'll have the necessary evidence to protect Emily." The night passed slowly, with Richard pretending to watch television programs, while his mind was completely absorbed in the awareness of the recorder working silently behind the sofa. When Patricia finished tidying the kitchen and joined him in the living room, he had to make a conscious effort to appear relaxed and natural, talking about trivial matters while discreetly observing if she noticed anything different in the environment. Around 10 o'clock at night, when Patricia announced she was tired and would go up to sleep, Richard said he would stay a few more minutes watching the news before going to the bedroom. As soon as he heard her footsteps upstairs, he silently got up and headed to the garage, where he could have privacy to review everything that had been recorded during the day. "Now I'll discover the truth about what happens in this house when I'm not present," he thought, sitting in an old chair in the middle of the cluttered garage. "God help me have the courage to face whatever I'm going to hear." With hands violently trembling, Richard removed the recorder from behind the sofa and took it to the garage, where he sat in a plastic chair under the dim light of a lamp hanging from the ceiling. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant noises of traffic and the sound of his own accelerated breathing as he connected the headphones to the device and prepared to listen to the day's recordings. At first, there were only everyday and trivial conversations. Patricia talking on the phone with a neighbor about cooking recipes, the sound of the television playing softly, footsteps through the rooms of the house during normal domestic activities. Richard began to feel cautious relief, thinking that perhaps his suspicions were really the product of paranoia and excessive stress related to concerns about Emily's health. But then around 2 in the afternoon, when he should have been at work carrying heavy materials under the sun, he heard the weak and hesitant voice of his daughter that made his blood freeze in his veins. "Mom, please. I don't want to take the blue medicine today," It makes me feel really sick. My God, what I'm hearing can't be true, he whispered to himself, turning up the volume on his headphones. Please let Patricia respond with kindness and understanding. The response that came through the headphones was like a dagger to Richard's heart, pronounced with an icy coldness that he had never heard in his wife's voice, not even during their most heated discussions about money or household responsibilities. Emily, you know you need to look sick when Daddy gets home from work, Patricia said, with a calculating and cruel tone that didn't match at all with the image of the dedicated mother she had built over the months. If he suspects you're pretending to be sick, he'll stop loving us and leave forever, leaving the two of us alone without money and without a home. The pause that followed was filled only by the muffled sound of sobs, which Richard recognized as Emily's. Do you want Daddy to abandon us, Emily? Do you want to be alone in the world with no one to take care of you? The emotional manipulation was so cruel and calculated that Richard felt nausea rising in his throat. So stop complaining and take the medicine I'm giving you, because that's what's going to keep our family together. Richard let the recorder fall to the concrete floor of the garage, the sound of the impact echoing in the silent space as he curled up in a fetal position, with his hands covering his face and hot tears streaming between his fingers. The confirmation of his worst suspicions hit him like an emotional tsunami that swept away any hope he might still have had that everything was a terrible misunderstanding or a product of his imagination, heightened by stress. His wife, the woman with whom he had shared 14 years of marriage, and whom he had chosen as the mother of his child, was deliberately poisoning Emily and using emotional blackmail to force the girl to participate in a sick charade that was destroying her physical and mental health. My poor girl has been living a nightmare every day, and I didn't notice because I trusted Patricia too much. He sobbed in the silence of the garage, feeling as if his world had completely collapsed around him. What kind of monster does this to their own daughter? Dawn arrived without Richard having been able to close his eyes during the entire night, his body remaining motionless in bed, while his mind seethed with terrifying images of what he had discovered through the recording. Patricia's cruel words echoed in his head like a scratched record that refused to stop. You need to look sick. Daddy will abandon us. Stop complaining and take the medicine. Each phrase was like a blade cutting through his soul, revealing a woman he didn't know, a predator disguised as a dedicated mother who had transformed their own home into a scene of psychological torture. When the alarm clock rang at 6 in the morning, Richard turned it off immediately and remained lying down, pretending to sleep while he watched Patricia get up and follow her morning routine with the disturbing naturalness of someone who had completely normalized her monstrous actions. How can she sleep peacefully knowing what she's doing to our daughter, he thought, watching her get ready in the mirror as if it were just another ordinary day. What kind of diabolical creature did I bring into my home? When Patricia went down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Richard waited a few minutes before quietly getting up and calling Raymond at work, using a hoarse voice and pretending to be too sick to leave home. Raymond, I won't be able to come to work today. I have a terrible virus, feeling very ill, he said on the phone, trying to sound convincing despite the anxiety consuming him. I think I caught something strong. I have a fever and can barely stand up straight. The lie came out with difficulty, as Richard had always been an honest and hard-working man who rarely missed work. But the urgency to protect Emily was greater than any moral scruple. If possible, ask someone to cover my activities today because I really am not in a condition to operate heavy machinery in this state. He hung up the phone and dressed quickly, preparing for what he knew would be the most important and most terrible day of his life. Today I'll discover the whole truth, and then I'll remove my daughter from this situation once and for all. Richard went down the stairs silently and headed to the kitchen, where he found Patricia preparing breakfast with mechanical and efficient movements, like an actress playing a role she had completely mastered over months of practice. "Good morning, my love. You're up early today," she said, turning to him with a smile that now seemed grotesque in light of the discoveries from the previous night. "Not feeling well? You look a bit strange." She approached as if to touch his forehead to check for fever, but Richard instinctively moved away, still unable to accept any physical contact with the woman who was systematically torturing his daughter. "Maybe you should stay home today and rest a bit. The suggestion came loaded with a bitter irony that she couldn't perceive. "I can take care of everything here, as I always do." Forcing himself to maintain a facade of normality that required every fiber of his willpower, Richard managed to respond in an apparently natural way. "Yeah, I think I'm incubating something indeed. But I need to go to work. You know how Raymond gets angry when someone misses without a serious reason." He grabbed a cup of coffee and pretended to drink, although his stomach was too upset to accept any food. "I'll take some medicine and see if I feel better during the day." Watching Patricia prepare 2 bowls of porridge, one normal and another that he now knew contained sinister ingredients designed to keep Emily debilitated, Richard felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with pretending to be sick. "How's Emily today? Did she have a good night?" The words came out automatically, part of the act he needed to maintain. "I hope she's feeling better than yesterday." Patricia was preparing porridge for Emily, discreetly adding a supplement that she claimed had been recommended by the doctor. "She had a restless night, poor thing. She woke up several times complaining of stomach pain, but I managed to calm her down and she went back to sleep," she said with the disturbing naturalness of someone who had perfected the art of lying about the suffering she herself caused. "Today I'm going to give her a special porridge that will help strengthen her, with vitamins and extra nutrients that Dr. Catherine recommended." The ease with which she lied about fictitious medical details was terrifying, revealing a level of planning and premeditation that made Richard question if he really knew the woman he had married. "I'm sure in a few days she'll be feeling much better." The smile that accompanied this statement was of pure evil in disguise. Sometimes the treatment gets more difficult before it starts to take effect. Richard finished drinking the coffee forcefully and headed to the garage, making sure to start the car so Patricia would hear the sound of the engine, creating the illusion that he was leaving for work as he did every morning. But instead of leaving the garage, he quietly turned off the engine and remained hidden among old tools and cardboard boxes stacked in the corners of the cluttered space. His hands were shaking as he set up the recorder to function in live listening mode, connecting the headphones and positioning the receiver to capture everything happening inside the house. His heart was beating so hard in his chest that he feared the sound might interfere with the recording quality, but he knew that this was his only chance to document the crimes being committed against his daughter. "Now I'll hear in real time all the cruelty that Patricia inflicts on Emily," he thought, adjusting the headphones on his ears. "And when I have enough evidence, I'll end this nightmare once and for all." The first sound that came through the headphones was Patricia's voice going up the stairs and calling Emily to come down for breakfast, using an apparently affectionate tone that Richard now knew was completely false. "Emily, my dear, come down here to have breakfast with me. I prepared that tasty porridge that you like." The lie about Emily liking the porridge was particularly cruel, considering that Richard had heard in the previous recording the girl begging not to be forced to eat it. "Come on, my princess, you can't stay in bed all day. You need to eat to be strong and healthy." Each loving word sounded like torture when Richard knew the truth behind Patricia's intentions. The sound of steps slowly descending the stairs came through the headphones, and Richard could imagine Emily dragging herself with difficulty, weakened by the poison she had been forced to ingest for months. "What a perfect mother I am, always taking care of my sickly daughter." The venomous sarcasm in Patricia's voice when she thought no one could hear her revealed her true nature. The conversation that followed in the kitchen was even more devastating than everything Richard had heard in the previous night's recording, revealing additional layers of cruelty and manipulation he hadn't imagined possible. "Come have your special porridge, darling," Patricia said with fake sweetness, and Richard could hear the sound of the chair being pulled out for Emily to sit at the table. "Today, I added extra ingredients that will help you feel better." The sinister irony of this statement made Richard clench his fist so hard his nails dug into his palms. Then came his daughter's weak and hesitant voice, laden with heartbreaking resignation. "Mom, I don't want to. It always makes me sick. Please, can I just have a glass of normal milk today?" The innocent plea of a child who didn't understand why she was being systematically poisoned by her own mother echoed through the headphones like a cry for help that Richard couldn't answer. "My stomach hurts so much after I drink this porridge." The painful honesty in Emily's voice contrasted brutally with Patricia's elaborate lies. Patricia's response came loaded with cruel impatience that Richard had never heard in her voice when she thought he was present, revealing a hidden face of her personality that was pure evil, disguised as maternal concern. "Emily, how many times do I need to explain the same thing to you? People only help us financially because you need special medical care," she said, and Richard could hear the sound of the spoon vigorously stirring the porridge, probably dissolving more harmful substances. "If you get better and become healthy, no one will feel sorry for us anymore. No one will give money to help with medications and appointments, and we'll become poor and abandoned." The financial manipulation was even more sinister than Richard had imagined, revealing that Patricia was turning Emily's fabricated illness into a profitable business. "Do you want us to be thrown onto the street like beggars?" The emotional blackmail was calculated to make a 14-year-old feel guilty for wanting to be healthy. "So stop complaining and drink your porridge already, because it's thanks to your little illness that we can live a comfortable life." What Richard heard next destroyed him emotionally in a way he didn't know was possible, revealing that Emily's suffering was even greater than his worst suspicions had suggested. His daughter's voice, broken by sobs she was trying to control, came through the headphones carrying a deep sadness that no child should bear. "But I want to go to school like other girls my age. I want to play in the park. I want to have friends." The simple dreams of a normal teenager sounded like impossible requests in the situation Emily had been imprisoned in. "Sometimes I see other children through the window running and playing, and I feel so envious that I end up crying alone in my room." The devastating confession revealed that Emily was completely aware of what she was missing, that she understood her life had been stolen from her. "When I was little, before I got sick, I remember I was happy." The nostalgia in the voice of a girl only 14 years old, talking about her childhood as if it were a distant and unattainable past, broke Richard's heart into pieces. Will I ever be able to be a normal child again? The cruelty of Patricia's response surpassed everything Richard had imagined possible from a mother speaking to her own daughter, revealing a level of evil he didn't know existed in the real world outside of horror movies. "Emily, you need to stop having these ridiculous fantasies about being normal," she said with a coldness that made Richard feel chills, even while hidden in the warm garage. "You'll never be a normal child anyway, because you were born different, with problems that have no definitive cure." The cruel lie was designed to destroy any hope Emily might have for a better future. "At least this way, being sick, you serve some useful purpose for this family, bringing us money and attention from people." The reduction of a child to a tool for financial gain was of such inhumanity that it made Richard silently vomit on the garage floor. "If you weren't even good for this, I don't know what we would do with you." The implied threat in the phrase was terrifying. "So be grateful you have at least this usefulness, and stop dreaming about things that will never happen." Richard had to remove the headphones from his ears for a few minutes to control the nausea and anger that threatened to make him run out of the garage to confront Patricia immediately. But he knew he needed more evidence before acting. When he put the headphones back on, he heard Emily crying softly while being forced to swallow the poisoned porridge, each spoonful accompanied by moans of pain and protest that were completely ignored by Patricia. "Swallow it all, don't leave anything in the bowl," ordered the mother with cruel authority. "And don't make that disgusted face, because you're going to take this every day until I decide you don't need it anymore." The sound of forced swallowing came through the headphones, like an echo of medieval torture, and Richard could hear Emily gagging slightly as she struggled not to vomit. "If you throw up, you'll have to take it all again, so you better keep it down." The threat was pronounced with the naturalness of someone who had perfected techniques of psychological coercion. "Now go to your room and lie down until I call you for lunch." The period that followed was filled with the sounds of Patricia tidying up the kitchen and humming cheerful melodies as if she had just performed an act of maternal kindness instead of having forced a child to ingest toxic substances. Richard heard the sound of the faucet washing the special bowl, the noise of cabinets being opened and closed as she put away the bottles with poisons disguised as medications, and even the sound of the television being turned on in the living room to watch morning programs. The domestic normality of these sounds contrasted surreally with the horror of what had just happened. creating a cognitive dissonance that made Richard question whether he was really hearing this or if he had developed some kind of mental disorder. She's acting as if she just gave her daughter breakfast, not as if she just poisoned her, he thought, feeling dizzy from the unreality of the situation. How can someone live with this duplicity without going completely insane? Around 10 in the morning, Richard heard through the headphones the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the outside area of the house, followed by Patricia's voice calling his name with growing urgency and irritation. "Richard! Richard, where are you?" she shouted, and he could hear that she was checking different rooms of the house looking for him. "Your car is in the garage, but you didn't answer when I called." The discovery that the car was still in the place where it should have left hours ago for work had obviously aroused her suspicion and concern. The sound of footsteps was getting closer and closer to the garage, and Richard realized he had been discovered in his hiding place. "Richard, are you in there? Why didn't you go to work today?" Her voice was getting louder and closer, and he knew that in a matter of seconds she would open the garage door and find him crouched among the tools with the recorder in his hands. "If you're sick, why didn't you tell me? Why are you hiding from me?" Richard silently rose from his crouched position and walked to the small garage window, from which he had a partial view of the kitchen through the back door of the house. What he saw through the dusty glass made him make an instantaneous decision that would change the course of everything. Emily was sitting alone at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, crying silently over the remains of the porridge she had been forced to swallow. Her thin shoulders trembled with each suppressed sob, and even from a distance, Richard could see how pale she was, and obviously suffering the effects of the substances she had ingested. The sight of his daughter in that state of despair and physical pain, combined with the proximity of Patricia's footsteps approaching the garage, created a moment of crystal clarity in his mind about what he needed to do. Enough evidence, enough recordings, enough waiting, he thought, turning off the recorder and heading toward the door. My daughter needs protection now, and I'm going to get her out of this situation today, before it's too late. Richard remained in the living room of the house throughout the morning, sitting in the armchair facing the front door, holding the small recorder with both hands as if it were a grenade about to explode. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he repeatedly listened to the most devastating excerpts of the recordings, each cruel word from Patricia digging deeper into his soul like sharp blades. The sound of Emily's voice begging not to take the poisoned porridge, mixed with Patricia's cold and calculating responses about keeping her daughter sick to make money, created a cycle of horror that he couldn't break. The house was wrapped in a heavy silence, broken only by Emily's occasional footsteps upstairs, where she had been sent to rest after forcibly ingesting toxic substances disguised as medications. "It's over, Patricia," he muttered to himself, mentally rehearsing the words he would use in the inevitable confrontation. "This time you won't be able to lie or manipulate your way out of this situation." When the familiar sound of the key turning in the lock echoed through the entrance hall around noon, Richard felt a surge of adrenaline course through his entire body, making his heart race like a high-revving engine. Patricia came through the door with shopping bags in her hands, apparently coming from the supermarket, humming softly a cheerful melody that contrasted obscenely with the gravity of what Richard had discovered about her monstrous actions. She was dressed in a floral blouse and business skirt, her hair perfectly arranged and makeup impeccable, as she always maintained her public appearance of an exemplary wife and mother who earned the sympathy and trust of everyone around her. "Richard, what are you doing home this time of day?" she asked with genuine surprise, stopping in the middle of the living room upon noticing her husband's unexpected presence. "Shouldn't you be at work carrying material for that new construction site Raymond mentioned yesterday?" She placed the bags on the floor and observed him with growing attention, noticing something different in his posture and expression. "You have a strange look on your face. Did something happen?" Richard slowly rose from the armchair, holding the recorder so she could clearly see it, and walked to the center of the room to stand face to face with the woman who had shared his life for 14 years, but who now seemed like a complete stranger to him. His legs were shaking, but his determination was unwavering as he watched Patricia's face try to process the presence of the electronic device in his hands. "Patricia, I need you to explain this to me," he said with a voice choked with emotion. raising the recorder between them like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "I need you to explain exactly what this recording I made yesterday in our own living room means." He pressed the play button, and the sound of her voice instructing Emily about pretending to be sick began to fill the tense silence of the room. "And especially, I need you to explain why our 14-year-old daughter is being systematically poisoned by her own mother." The words came out laden with deep pain and contained anger that made his voice tremble. "I want to hear from your mouth the justification for this monstrosity." Patricia's face instantly paled when she recognized her own voice coming from the small device, and Richard could see how her pupils dilated with shock as she processed the fact that she had been discovered in her elaborate lies and manipulations. Her hands began to visibly shake, and she took a few steps backward, as if trying to physically distance herself from the incriminating evidence that was being played in her own living room. "Richard, this is not what you think," she said with a trembling voice, trying to maintain some control over the situation that was rapidly slipping from her hands. "You took that recording out of context. You didn't understand what was happening." She tried to force a reassuring smile, but her expression betrayed the growing panic she felt upon realizing there was no possible escape from that situation. "I can explain everything. It's just a terrible misunderstanding." The desperate denial came out rushed, as if the words could somehow erase the reality of the evidence. "You know I would never harm our daughter. I'm a dedicated mother." Richard increased the volume of the recorder, allowing the most devastating words of the conversation between Patricia and Emily to completely fill the environment. The confession about purposely keeping the girl sick, the emotional blackmail about him abandoning the family, the cruel threats about Emily never being normal, and especially the cold admission about using her daughter's fabricated illness as a source of income through the sympathy and donations from other people. Each phrase that came from the device was like a hammer demolishing any possibility of denial or additional manipulation, creating an impenetrable wall of evidence that not even Patricia's skills for distorting reality could circumvent. "Patricia, I'm hearing your own voice admitting that you keep our daughter sick on purpose to get money from generous people who pity our situation," he said, his voice growing in volume and intensity. "I'm hearing you threaten a 14-year-old child, telling her she will never be normal, and that at least she's useful for something in this sick way." Tears began to stream down Richard's face as he spoke. "How can you look at yourself in the mirror every day, knowing you're torturing our own daughter?" The transformation that followed in Patricia's face and behavior was terrifying to witness, as if a carefully constructed mask worn for years had been violently torn off, revealing the true nature hiding beneath the facade of dedicated wife and mother. Her features hardened, the blue eyes that were once warm became cold as ice, and her posture changed from defensive to aggressive in a transformation that lasted only a few seconds. "Fine, Richard. You want the truth? Then I'll give you the complete truth," she said in a voice he had never heard before, stripped of any pretense or artificial sweetness. "Do you think it was easy living on your miserable construction worker salary? Do you think it was simple to keep up appearances in this neighborhood with the little money you brought home?" She crossed her arms over her chest in a defiant posture, as if defending a perfectly rational position. "This situation with Emily's illness has guaranteed us a much better life than we would ever have with your pathetic income." The contempt in her voice was palpable and cruel. "People pity us, help us financially, donate money for expensive medications, give us gifts and attention." Richard was paralyzed for a few seconds, not just by the words he was hearing, but by the complete absence of remorse or guilt in Patricia's tone of voice as she openly admitted to having turned a child's suffering into a profitable scheme of emotional extortion. The woman standing before him at that moment was a complete stranger, a cold predator who had manipulated not only her own family, but an entire network of kind people who had offered genuine help, believing they were contributing to the treatment of a truly sick child. "Patricia, are you telling me that you poisoned our daughter for months, that you destroyed her physical and mental health, that you stole her childhood all for money?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising in volume as the magnitude of the betrayal became clear. Are you telling me that you turned our own home into a torture scene to get money from generous people?" He clenched his fist so tightly that his nails dug into his palm. What kind of monster does this to their own daughter? Patricia's response came loaded with a coldness that made Richard feel as if he were talking to a psychopath, completely devoid of human empathy or basic maternal instinct. Monster? Richard, you're very naive if you think there's anything monstrous about ensuring a comfortable life for the family, she said with disdain, as if explaining simple concepts to a slow child. Emily was destined to be a problematic girl anyway, with those whims and tantrums she's always had since she was little. At least this way she serves some useful purpose, bringing us financial benefits and the sympathy of people around us. She gestured toward the well-decorated house around them. Look around, Richard. We managed to renovate the house, buy new furniture, have decent clothes, eat well every day. The pride in her voice was nauseating. All thanks to the generosity of people who are moved by our difficult situation. She laughed bitterly and cruelly. And the best part is that everyone sees me as a heroic mother who sacrifices herself for her sick daughter. Richard felt a wave of nausea rise up his throat as he processed the full extent of the manipulation and deception that had been built around him for months, involving not just his family, but an entire community of kind people who had been deceived by a skillful sociopath. "You are destroying our daughter, Patricia," he shouted, completely losing control of his emotions. Emily is an innocent child who should be playing, going to school, making friends, living a normal teenage life. His words came out interspersed with indignation and despair. Instead, she's being systematically poisoned by her own mother, forced to pretend an illness she doesn't have, isolated from the outside world like a prisoner in her own home. He approached her, pointing his finger accusingly. "You stole her childhood, stole her health, stole her happiness, all for a few dollars that you can extort from generous people." The pain in his voice was heartbreaking. "How can you sleep at night knowing that you're torturing an innocent child?" Patricia's response was even more shocking than her previous admissions, revealing a level of inhumanity that Richard didn't know existed in the real world, much less in the woman he had married and chosen as the mother of his daughter. "Richard, you need to stop dramatizing this situation as if it were some kind of Shakespearean tragedy," she said in an irritated and condescending tone of voice. Emily was never going to be a normal child anyway. She was always strange, introverted, different from other girls her age. She spoke about her own daughter as if she were discussing a defective object. At least this way, being sick, she serves some useful purpose in this family, providing us with a stable source of income and the admiration of people around us. The cynicism in her words was chilling. If she were healthy, she would just be another problematic teenager consuming resources without giving anything in return. The ease with which she reduced a child to a financial tool was terrifying. At least this way she has a function in life, a real utility. In that moment, Richard realized that he had never really known the woman with whom he had shared 14 years of his life, who had shared dreams, plans, joys and sorrows with a person who was fundamentally different from everything he had imagined about her moral and emotional nature. The Patricia standing before him was not the loving woman he had known during their courtship, not the dedicated wife of the first years of marriage, not even the apparently concerned mother he had observed taking care of Emily during the past few months. "I don't know you," he said in a voice broken by disillusionment and horror. "All these years I've lived with a complete stranger, an actress playing the role of loving wife and mother." He shook his head in disbelief. "The woman I loved doesn't exist, never existed." Tears flowed freely down his face as he spoke. "I married an illusion, and my daughter is paying the price for my blindness." It was in this moment of maximum emotional tension that Emily appeared at the entrance to the living room, obviously drawn by the screams and heated discussion that echoed throughout the entire house. She was as pale as a ghost, wearing loose pajamas that accentuated her extreme thinness even more, and her large, frightened eyes alternated between Richard and Patricia as if she were witnessing a scene from a horror movie. Her legs visibly trembled as she leaned against the doorframe, clearly weakened by the effects of the substances she had been forced to ingest during breakfast. "Daddy," she said in a weak and hesitant voice. "Mommy." The confusion and fear in her expression were heartbreaking, revealing a child who did not fully understand the nature of the discussion, but who intuitively perceived that her life was about to change drastically. "Why are you shouting?" She looked at Richard with an expression that mixed hope and terror. "What's happening?" Richard turned to his daughter and felt his heart shatter at the sight of the physical and emotional state she was in, a direct result of months of systematic torture she had suffered at the hands of her own mother. "Emily, my princess, come here to me," he said in a choked voice, extending his arms toward the girl. "Daddy found out what was happening to you, and now everything is going to change." He kept the recorder firmly in one hand as he prepared to protect his daughter from any violent reaction Patricia might have. "I won't have to take those horrible medicines anymore. You won't have to pretend you're sick. You won't have to be afraid anymore." Tears streamed down his face as he spoke. "Daddy will protect you from now on. I promise." Patricia, realizing that her position was becoming untenable and that the evidence against her was irrefutable, decided to make one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the situation through physical force and psychological intimidation. She quickly advanced toward Richard, with her eyes fixed on the recorder he was holding, in an attempt to forcibly take the device before he could use it as evidence against her. "You're not going to destroy everything I've built over these months," she shouted, her voice laden with desperate fury. "Give me that recorder right now." Her hands extended toward the device, but Richard quickly backed away, protecting the evidence against his own body. "Richard, you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing." The desperation in her voice was palpable. "If you expose our situation, we'll lose everything. We'll be poor again. We'll be publicly humiliated." Richard protected the recorder with both hands, holding it against his chest in a defensive position while avoiding Patricia's attempts to take it by force. "Patricia, get away from me," he shouted, using his own body as a shield to protect the evidence that could save his daughter. "You've done enough harm to this family." He backed toward the wall, always keeping himself between Patricia and Emily, who watched the scene with growing terror. "I won't let you continue torturing our daughter." The determination in his voice was unshakable, even in the face of Patricia's physical aggression. "This recorder is going to the police, and you'll answer for all the crimes you've committed against an innocent child." His words came out loaded with an authority he had never exercised before in their marriage. "It's over, Patricia. Your reign of terror in this house ends today." Patricia's final response was a last desperate cry from someone who saw her entire elaborate scheme crumbling before her eyes, revealing the panic of a cornered criminal who had no more exits or escape strategies. "Richard, you're an idiot if you think anyone will believe you," she screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Everyone in this neighborhood knows me as a dedicated and exemplary mother who sacrifices herself for her sick daughter." She gesticulated frantically, trying one last card of psychological manipulation. "I have years of reputation as a perfect wife and mother, while you're just an ignorant laborer who never cared about your own daughter's medical care." Her words tumbled out with the urgency of despair. "Nobody will believe such an absurd accusation coming from someone like you." She pointed an accusatory finger at Richard. "Everyone will think you've gone mad from working too much under the sun." It was in this moment of maximum tension and verbal confrontation that Emily, who until then had remained silent observing the discussion between her parents, finally broke down in uncontrollable tears as she partially comprehended the extent of the situation in which she had been imprisoned for months. Her sobs echoed through the room like a lament that cut through all the anger and tension, revealing the profound suffering of a child who finally understood that her own mother had been responsible for all the pain and isolation she had experienced. "Mom, why did you do this to me?" she cried, her voice broken by sobs. "I just wanted to get better so I could play again." Her words came out loaded with a devastating innocence that revealed the complete cruelty of what had been done against her. "I don't understand why you gave me medicine that made me sick." She crouched down and huddled against the doorframe, as if trying to make herself invisible. "I just wanted you to love me for real." The sight of Emily collapsing in tears at the doorframe, finally understanding that her own mother had been responsible for all her suffering for months, awakened in Richard a protective instinct more powerful than any force he had ever felt in his entire life. Without hesitating for even a second, he quickly crossed the room toward his daughter, passing by Patricia, who was still trying to argue about her innocence, and knelt beside the girl who was trembling uncontrollably on the floor. "Emily, my princess, Daddy's here now," he said with a choked voice, wrapping her in his protective arms. "No one is going to hurt you anymore, I promise." With careful movements, he lifted the girl from the floor, surprised at how light and fragile her body had become after months of being systematically poisoned by her own mother. Emily was just skin and bones, weighing much less than a 14-year-old girl should weigh, and Richard felt a wave of devastating guilt as he realized how he had failed to protect her for so long. "We're leaving this house right now," he murmured in her ear, firmly holding the recorder in one hand. "You'll never have to be afraid of taking those horrible medicines again." Richard walked quickly toward the front door of the house, carrying Emily in his arms as if she were a porcelain doll that could break with any sudden movement, while behind him, Patricia screamed in a mixture of despair and fury as she realized she was completely losing control of the situation. "Richard, you've gone completely insane. Put Emily on the ground immediately," she screamed, following them across the room with hurried steps. "She's too weak to leave the house. You'll kill her if you take her outside in this state." Her words tumbled out with the urgency of panic, in a desperate attempt to use concern for Emily's health as a weapon of manipulation, even after being exposed as the true person responsible for the girl's debilitated condition. "People will think you're an irresponsible father who doesn't care about his own daughter's well-being." She stretched her arms toward Emily, as if trying to forcibly take her from Richard's arms. "She needs specialized medical care. She can't be exposed to the cold and humidity of the street." The cruel irony of her words echoed through the house as she pretended a maternal concern that Richard now knew to be completely false. When Richard opened the front door and stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the house, carrying Emily and carefully protecting the recorder that contained all the evidence against Patricia, the afternoon sunlight hit the girl's pale face for the first time in weeks. Emily blinked several times, clearly unaccustomed to the natural light after having spent so much time confined to a dark room, pretending to be too sick to leave the house. "Daddy, the sun is so beautiful," she murmured in a weak voice, but there was something different in her tone, a hint of hope that hadn't existed for months. "It's been so long since I've seen a real blue sky." Richard felt his heart tighten as he realized how something as simple as sunlight had become a luxury denied to his own daughter. Patricia ran out after them, screaming even louder now that they were in a public space where her reputation as a dedicated mother could be questioned. "Help! Someone help me! My husband has gone crazy and is kidnapping our sick daughter." She screamed into the street in a desperate attempt to mobilize the neighborhood against Richard. "He'll kill the girl if someone doesn't stop him." Patricia's hysterical screams in the quiet street of the residential neighborhood began to attract the attention of curious neighbors who left their houses to see what was causing such a commotion on an apparently peaceful Tuesday afternoon. Richard recognized several familiar faces. Mrs. Dorothy, the elderly lady who lived in the house next door and always asked about Emily's health, the retired mechanic who occasionally helped with small car repairs, the family with their 3 young children who played in the yard of the house across the street. All of them had been deceived by Patricia for months, contributing with donations of money, expensive medications, and even offers of help to care for the poor sick girl. "Please, someone call the police. My husband had a psychotic break and is putting our daughter's life at risk." Patricia continued to scream, running in circles around Richard like a desperate actress on an improvised stage. "He doesn't understand that she needs constant medical care." Her tears seemed genuine to those who didn't know the truth, and Richard could see the confusion on the faces of the neighbors who had always known Patricia as an exemplary and dedicated mother. "Emily could die if she's exposed to street conditions." The dramatic performance was convincing to anyone who hadn't heard the incriminating recordings. Mrs. Dorothy, a 65-year-old woman who had lost a teenage daughter to cancer and had always shown particular affection for Emily, approached with a concerned expression and extended her arms toward the girl. "Richard's son, what's happening here?" "Shouldn't Emily be at home resting?" she asked with genuine concern. her hands trembling slightly as she observed the physical state of the girl. "She's so pale and thin. She seems to have gotten much worse since the last time I saw her." Her kind eyes alternated between Richard and Patricia, clearly confused about which version of the facts she should believe. "Patricia, why are you screaming like this? What did Richard do?" She placed a protective hand over her heart, visibly shaken by the tension of the situation. Other neighbors also began to approach, forming a small circle around the family in crisis, all murmuring among themselves about what could be the cause of that domestic drama being publicly exposed. "Someone should call an ambulance for the girl," suggested the mechanic, observing how fragile Emily looked in her father's arms. "She doesn't look like someone who should be outside the house." Richard realized that he was rapidly losing the support of the neighbors, who naturally tended to believe Patricia's version due to the reputation she had carefully built over the months as a heroic and dedicated mother. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince them of the shocking truth about the woman they admired, especially when she continued to play the role of a desperate mother trying to protect her sick daughter from an apparently unstable father. "Listen, all of you, please," he said in a loud, clear voice, trying to capture the attention of everyone present. "I know this will seem impossible to believe, but Patricia is not who you think she is." He held the recorder up high so everyone could see it clearly. "For months, she has been poisoning our daughter intentionally, keeping her sick to get money and sympathy from kind people like you." The words came out loaded with pain and determination. "I have recorded proof of her own voice confessing these crimes." Richard observed the confused and skeptical faces around him. "I know it's hard to believe, but please, listen to these recordings before judging any of us." Patricia immediately realized the danger that the recorder posed to her strategy of manipulating the public perception of the situation, and intensified her dramatic screams in a desperate attempt to prevent Richard from playing the incriminating evidence. "Don't listen to him. Richard is having a nervous breakdown because of work stress and worries about Emily's illness," she shouted, gesturing frantically to the neighbors. "He recorded our conversations without permission and is interpreting everything in a distorted way because he can't accept that our daughter has a serious medical condition." Her tears flowed abundantly down her face, in a performance that would have been convincing if Richard didn't know the truth about her calculating nature. "You've known me for years. You know what kind of mother I am. You know how I dedicate myself fully to Emily's care." She pointed accusingly at her husband. "Now he's gone crazy and wants to destroy our family with absurd accusations." Her voice broke dramatically with each sentence. "Please don't let him harm our daughter." Richard, realizing he was quickly losing the battle for public opinion in the face of Patricia's convincing performance, made the most courageous decision of his life. He turned the recorder to maximum volume and let Patricia's own voice confessing her crimes echo through the silent neighborhood street. The first sound that came from the device was Emily's weak voice begging not to take the poisoned porridge, followed by Patricia's cold and cruel response explaining that the girl needed to pretend to be sick to maintain the flow of money and sympathy from the community. "Emily, you know you need to look sick when Daddy arrives. If he suspects you're pretending, he'll stop loving us and leave forever." Patricia's voice came out clear and unmistakable from the small device, causing immediate silence in the street as neighbors processed what they were hearing. "People only help us because you need special care. If you get better, no one will feel sorry for us anymore." The cruel words echoed through the neighborhood like stones thrown at a window, completely shattering the image of a dedicated mother that Patricia had so carefully constructed. "You'll never be a normal child anyway. At least this way you serve some useful purpose for this family." The impact of the recordings on the neighbors was immediate and devastating, as if an emotional bomb had exploded in the middle of the quiet street, revealing a truth so shocking that many of them initially refused to believe what their own ears were capturing. Mrs. Dorothy brought her hands to her mouth in a gesture of absolute horror, her eyes filling with tears, as she looked alternately at Patricia and at Emily in Richard's arms. "My God in heaven, this can't be true," she muttered in a trembling voice. "Patricia, tell us that's not your voice in that recording. Tell us you didn't do these horrible things to Emily." Her words came out as a desperate plea for reality, to be different from what was being revealed. He took off his cap and squeezed it between his hands, clearly shaken by what he had heard. "In 50 years living in this neighborhood, I never thought I would witness something like this," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. A mother poisoning her own daughter for money. The family hugged their small children tighter, as if trying to protect them from the evil that had been revealed so close to their homes. "How can a person do this?" asked the mother, looking at Emily with deep compassion. "To an innocent child?" Patricia, realizing that her reputation and her version of facts had been completely shattered by the very words that had come out of her mouth through the recorder, went into complete despair and began frantically denying the authenticity of the recordings. "That's a lie. This recording was altered, it was edited, it was fabricated by Richard to incriminate me," she shouted with a voice hoarse from despair. "You can't believe evidence that could have been digitally manipulated." Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she gestured in a pathetic attempt to maintain some credibility before the community she had deceived for months. "Richard hired someone to imitate my voice and create this fake recording because he wants to get rid of me and gain custody of Emily." The accusation came out desperate and illogical, revealing a woman who had completely lost control of the situation. "You know me. You know I would never harm my own daughter." She approached Mrs. Dorothy with tears in her eyes. "Dorothy, you saw me taking care of Emily during all these months. You know what kind of mother I am." It was at this moment of maximum tension and revelation that Emily, who had remained silent in her father's arms throughout the public discussion, finally found the courage to speak and publicly confirm the truth about her suffering. With a weak voice but clear enough to be heard by all the neighbors present, she slightly lifted her head from Richard's shoulder and said the words that changed everything. "Daddy, I don't want to pretend I'm sick anymore." Her whisper cut through all the confusion and denial like a sharp blade, unequivocally confirming that the recordings were real and that she had been forced to participate in the cruel charade orchestrated by Patricia. "I want to be able to play again, like before I got sick." For the first time in months, a weak but genuine smile appeared on her pale face, as if an invisible chain that had been binding her had finally been broken. "Mommy gave me medicine that made me feel really sick and told me I had to pretend I was sicker than I really was." Her words were broken by emotion, but each syllable was pronounced with a clarity that left no doubt about the truthfulness of her testimony. "I didn't want to lie to Daddy anymore, but she said he would leave if he knew the truth." Emily's innocent testimony had an even more devastating impact on the neighbors than the recordings themselves, as it came directly from the victim of that cruel scheme, pronounced with the simple honesty of a child who finally felt safe to speak the truth. Mrs. Dorothy approached Richard and gently touched Emily's arm, her tears flowing freely down her wrinkled face. "My dear girl, how much you must have suffered in silence all this time," she said, with a voice choked with emotion. "Forgive Grandma Dorothy for not realizing you were asking for help." She looked at Richard with admiration and respect. "Richard, you are a hero for discovering this and saving your daughter." Then she turned to Patricia with an expression of absolute disgust. "And you, Patricia, you are a monster. There is no forgiveness for what you did to this innocent child." The mechanic also approached, placing a protective hand on Richard's shoulder. "Son, you did the right thing. This girl needs protection and real medical care, not the tortures that this woman was inflicting on her." The family kept their distance, but the mother nodded positively to Richard. "We will testify in your favor if necessary." It was at this moment that the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the neighborhood streets, rapidly approaching the house where all that dramatic revelation was happening before the shocked neighbors. Richard had discreetly called emergency services even before confronting Patricia with the recordings, requesting both an ambulance and police presence, as he suspected the situation could escalate to physical violence when Patricia realized she had been completely unmasked. "Help is coming, my princess," he whispered in Emily's ear, who cuddled even closer against her father's chest upon hearing the sound of sirens. "Soon you'll be in a real hospital with real doctors who will take proper care of you." He looked around at the neighbors who had become unwitting witnesses to that family drama. "Thank you all for having listened to the truth and for supporting my daughter at this moment." His words came out loaded with genuine gratitude. "I know it must be shocking to discover that you were deceived for so long. Patricia, hearing the sound of approaching sirens and realizing that her situation was becoming legally untenable, panicked completely and attempted one last desperate escape strategy. She ran toward the car parked in the garage in an attempt to flee before authorities arrived. "I'm not going to stay here to be publicly humiliated by false accusations," she shouted, running awkwardly toward the vehicle. "You'll regret believing Richard's lies." Her words came out choppy from running and desperation. But the neighbors, now completely convinced of Patricia's guilt by the irrefutable evidence they had heard, and Emily's testimony, quickly organized themselves to prevent her escape. Despite his advanced age, the mechanic was the first to move, blocking the path between Patricia and the car. "No, ma'am. You're not running away after what you did to that child," he said authoritatively. "You're going to stay here and answer for your actions before the law." Mrs. Dorothy and other neighbors joined him, forming a human barrier. "You'll pay for every tear you made that girl shed." When the ambulance and 2 police cars finally arrived on the street, they found a scene that would become legendary in the neighborhood's history, an entire community united to protect a child victim of abuse and prevent the perpetrator from escaping justice. The paramedics quickly descended from the ambulance and went directly to Richard, who was still holding Emily in his arms, while the police officers rapidly assessed the situation and approached Patricia, who had been effectively surrounded by the indignant neighbors. "Sir, we received a call about a medical emergency involving a minor," said the chief paramedic, a middle-aged man with a professional and caring expression. "May I examine the girl? She needs to be evaluated immediately." Richard carefully handed Emily over to the medical care, but remained by her side, while the paramedics made a preliminary assessment of her physical condition. "She was systematically poisoned by her own mother for months," he explained to the healthcare professionals. "I have recordings that prove everything." He showed the device to the police officers. "This girl needs urgent medical care to reverse the damage caused by the toxic substances she was forced to ingest." The police lieutenant, an experienced man who had seen many cases of child abuse during his career, but rarely anything as systematic and cruel as what was being reported, listened attentively to the summary of the situation provided by Richard and the witness neighbors. "Sir, these are very serious accusations," he said, taking out a notebook to write down the details of the case. "Child abuse, intentional poisoning, fraud to obtain financial advantages." He looked at Patricia, who continued to deny any guilt despite being surrounded by overwhelming evidence. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, but you need to come with us to provide clarification about these accusations." His voice was firm but professional. "And Mr. Richard, we'll need those recordings as evidence along with detailed statements from all involved." He observed Emily being carefully examined by the paramedics. "The most important thing now is to ensure that this girl receives appropriate medical care." The relief in his voice was evident. "Cases like this remind me why I chose this profession." As Emily was carefully placed on a stretcher to be transported to the hospital, she firmly held Richard's hand and asked the question that summarized all her dreams and hopes during the months of torture she had suffered. "Daddy, can I be a normal girl now?" she asked in a weak voice but filled with a hope he hadn't heard in a long time. "Can I go to school, make friends, play in the park like other children?" Her words came out choppy with emotion, but there was a light in her eyes that Richard hadn't seen since before that whole situation began. "Will I no longer need to pretend I'm sick?" The simple question carried the weight of months of suffering and the hope of a finally free future. "Will I be able to climb the mango tree in the backyard again?" The weak smile that accompanied this question was like the sunrise after the longest night of Richard's life. "Do you promise you'll stay with me at the hospital?" She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "I'm afraid of being alone again." Richard walked alongside the stretcher as the paramedics took her toward the ambulance, holding Emily's small, cold hand with all the paternal love that had been suffocated by months of worry and ignorance about what was really happening in his own home. "Yes, my princess. Now you will be completely free," he said with tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his face. "You'll be able to be the happy and healthy girl you've always been, before all this evil happened." He leaned down to gently kiss her forehead before she was placed inside the ambulance. "Daddy will stay with you at the hospital. I won't leave your side for even a minute." The words came out as a sacred promise that he knew he would religiously keep. And when you fully recover, we'll build together the most beautiful treehouse that has ever existed in this world. He smiled through the tears. You will have the childhood you deserve, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost. But even amid all that hope and relief, Richard knew deep in his heart that Emily's journey of physical and emotional healing was just beginning, and that it would take a lot of time, patience, and love to completely repair the damage caused by the systematic cruelty she had suffered at the hands of her own mother. Now tell me in the comments where you're from, and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on screen. See you there.